All right, so good evening actually from Berlin. It's 10 p.m., but it's actually 4 p.m. in Gainesville, Florida, and we are with Dr. Ilaria Capua, who is a very, very well-known virologist. She has been almost a permanent presence in Italian TV. I understand you'd been reached out by the Cuomo New York government for advice and the Italian government, among others. So I'm very grateful for you talking to me. I basically have a sort of set of questions that I want to ask you that have to do with a lot of the discussion that you see sort of out in the open in the public, people that are not specialized and are hearing cacophony in many cases of different voices. So the first question that I want to ask you is whether the numbers that we're seeing across the board, but probably particularly for Italy, where you're familiar with the case in the US, are actually reliable.
Well, I mean, it's not a secret that this pandemic took everyone by surprise. And so one of the biggest problems that we have is actually counting things in a harmonized way. And so you asked me if the numbers are reliable. The numbers are what they are, considering that the sampling procedure, even within the same country, has been different. And so it's very, very difficult to make any comparison. What I can say is that although there are some difficulties in understanding this issue, because it's such a complex issue, there are some areas in which we understand that this is a truly multifactorial issue. Like, for example, there have been some parts of the world which have been hit more dramatically, and this includes Lombardy, Madrid, and New York. So certainly in these big cities, there have been some additional drivers which need to be understood so that we can learn better how to coexist with this infection.
Do you have any hypothesis? I have heard you in several occasions talk about it, but I never really heard a very clear answer. Do you have any hypothesis as to why is it that in places like Bergamo, Brescia, we're seeing numbers that are essentially, up to 10, 13% mortality rate, whereas the rest of Italy, for instance, holds pattern with the rest of the European mortality rates?
Yeah, so of course, I don't have the answer, but there are some drivers. For example, in that area surrounding Milan, there is a very, very well-developed public transportation network that could have been the cause of the spread of the disease, because the trains are actually a bit old. They are trains for the periphery of Milan, and they connect. There's a lot of commuters on those trains. We know that young people generally develop a non-symptomatic or a mild form, but in Italy, there's a lot of families that still have their grandparents at home, and probably the amount of virus which came in contact with this elderly population is much higher than in any other place, because the mobility in other places is lower. And then
it's really kind of counterintuitive, but at the same time, really remarkable. The idea that somebody that is asymptomatic and has mobility essentially becomes immediately much more dangerous than somebody that is symptomatic, because you can identify him, right?
Yes, exactly. So we know that there are a certain proportion of cases that are non-symptomatic. I've seen numbers that are so different that I don't even want to comment on them. Let's say, as a virologist and as someone who has worked with avian coronaviruses, so they're different, but the disease is actually very similar, I wouldn't be surprised if in a healthy population, even, up to 80% of the population can get infected without showing any symptoms. That is certainly something that happens in animals.
Do you think that, so what are the chances that what we're seeing in a place like Bergamo or in a place like New York are mutations of the virus, is something other than what we're seeing in Puglia or that we're seeing in Campania?
Well, to know whether the virus has mutated, there's only one way, and the way is to look at the sequence. And so the sequences that are available tell us whether the virus has mutated. Unfortunately, there is a low contribution of the Italian scientific community to the number of sequences that are publicly available. So, yeah.
Is there a reason for this? Is there a way in which is there a world or a global attempt at compared sequencing?
Yes, so this is something that has been going on for a while. There are open access databases which collect this information. And at the moment, there are thousands of sequences from other countries and a handful, maybe I think we're up to 40 from Italy. So I have no evidence to say that the virus has mutated, and I have no evidence to say that the virus has not mutated because we don't have enough samples.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, something that just crossed my mind is that one of the things that we were told, I was told in last week's conversation with somebody working as an intensive care unit doctor, was that they're seeing pathologies that are not associated with pulmonary function. So they're seeing things like hallucinations and encephalopathies. They're seeing kidney failure, and the virus actually apparently detected in the kidney in China, if I'm not mistaken. Is this something of which you're familiar? Do you have any sense if this is something that is either normal?
Well, what I can say is that we've only known this virus for 4 months, and it's really difficult to make any statements. But the disease I was referring to before, in avian infectious bronchitis, which of course it's a disease of birds, but the virus is very similar, and it gives both respiratory forms and kidney failure. So it would not surprise me. You actually get enteric forms as well. And in fact, one of the things that could happen is that the virus could start behaving in a different way in different age groups.
Okay. So the question that I also want to ask you is, does quarantining actually work?
Yes, quarantine. So quarantine, there are two things that we know for sure that work. One is quarantine and the other one is hygienic measures. So quarantine in the largest, let's say, dimension possible. So with that, I mean staying at home and social distancing and, obeying to the regulations which don't allow you to go shopping in peak hours and all of that. That is quarantine. That is the concept of quarantine. Quarantine works. However, I think that there is a misunderstanding about quarantine, because it's not governments that make quarantines work. It's people that make quarantines work. So people need to understand that they have to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And when I get asked, oh, but can I do this and can I do that and can I do that? We know by now what we can and what we can't do and what is right and what is wrong. There are no rules. The scientists are learning together with patients. And so we have to work together to make this pathogen, which is going to remain with us for a very long time, less dangerous and less pathogenic than what it is now.
So that's this is something that comes across, especially as you're seeing a great disparity of quarantine measures across Europe. Even within Germany, in Berlin, where today the streets were absolutely full. And at the very same time, I mean, you look at Bayern, Bavaria in the south, and you see sort of much more restrictive measures. Really the last question I sort of want to ask you is about what is the end game? I mean, what happens at the end of this process? How is it that our situation changes? Because this is the way that I'm thinking about is that many people, I mean, much of the discussion, and this is what Bolsonaro, actually the president of Brazil, said only a couple of days ago, which is that we're going to get 70% of infection anyway. This is not something that we can avoid. We might as well just do it now. And of course, I mean, the issue might be infrastructure, but in terms of infections and illness and death, this looks like, a dog waiting in the street, and doesn't matter how long we're at home. When we come out, it will be out there ready to attack us. Can you perhaps comment on this, or give me maybe a better account of how is it disposed?
Yes, so what does this virus do? This virus behaves like an opportunistic pathogen, in that in most cases it creates a clinical condition, and a severe clinical condition, if there are underlying conditions. There are only low numbers of people who do not have underlying conditions, and among underlying conditions, I would add the co-factor of age, because age is an underlying condition. We know that above a certain age, we are more at risk of getting certain diseases than people who are younger. So basically, what we need to do for countries that have gone through an emergency, or areas that have gone through an emergency, like Lombardia and like Madrid and like New York, the first thing you need to do is to get the hospitals back to business as usual, and on a plan to pick up all those, let's say, programmed surgeries and programmed interventions, which were pushed out because of the COVID emergency. Once the hospitals are back working, at that point, what can be ensured is that if somebody does get sick, that person gets appropriate care. And so it will depend on a gradual repopulation, which will have to be based on risk factors and of the person. So certain people that have certain conditions will have to stay at home until there is a vaccine, or until the virus is circulating at very low levels. And I would like to add that so influenza is a much more severe disease than COVID-19. A lot of European citizens don't get influenza vaccine, not even in people who are over 65. And so we are coexisting already with the virus, which is more dangerous than this virus. Mm-hmm. So going back to your question, what we need to do is we need to make sure that hospitals can respond, and then repopulate with people who are young, who have low risk factors. Women, for example, have a smaller chance of developing the severe form. If you look at the Spanish numbers for ICU, women and men, you see that 3/4 of ICU patients are men. So that means that if you repopulate with a higher percentage of women, these women will get less sick for whatever reason. And there is...
What do you mean by repopulate exactly? I mean...
Repopulating is after quarantine, when people start going back in the streets and start going back to work and start working. So in Italy is still in lockdown. And so one of the things that we are trying to push is to use a gender balanced repopulation, because so we get 50% women and 50% men back into the working environment. And then we're going to have to coexist with this virus like we do with many other viruses. We coexist with measles. We coexist with noroviruses. We coexist with Zika. I mean, we coexist with many viruses. I think that there are a series of peculiarities around this pandemic. Certainly, it has been an accelerated pandemic because of global travel. There was an enormous viral wave that infected the whole world in a month, and this is completely unprecedented. And then people were not prepared, and there were fake news, and then there were a series of other aspects that created, I would say, outlier situations, like what we saw in Lombardia or in Madrid, for example.
Let me ask you. I mean, the time is short, but let me ask you just two quick questions. One is, do you think that the protocols, as well as the medicine, so vaccine or otherwise, to treat the virus and to treat COVID-19 will actually improve or will appear? Do you think that a vaccine is a realistic expectation?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, there are 70 groups that are working on a vaccine, and the vaccine will come. I am unsure if it will be used because we don't use influenza vaccines. So maybe it will be recommended only for the elderly because that's the best way to keep the clinical, or for categories at risk that we are learning to understand, because we have heard about hypertension, and then we heard about diabetes, and then we heard, so as we learn, we will understand which are the categories that are to be vaccinated. And the treatment is also, I mean, rather close, I would expect. I mean, we have antivirals, they have shown to work. They need some adjustments, but I think it's just a matter of time.
That's well, it's a hopeful note. I mean, the idea that people will not use the vaccine is really just remarkable. And in fact, I mean, this is something that probably a conversation for another time, but the question of sort of reliance on vaccine and reliance on public health. However, I do want to ask you, and you of course have the right not to talk about it if you don't want to, but the question of sort of scientific literacy in the political and policy decision-making process. I mean, we just had this completely really crazy press conference last night in which Clorox or chlorine was recommended. What do you make of it? I mean, from the point of view of somebody that is, dealing essentially with virological issues. I mean, intuitively, one would think that this is actually in some way a promotion of viral vectors.
Well, no, what I was going to say is that actually I think that this pandemic is bringing devastation and is a catastrophic event, but it has a silver lining. It has many silver linings, and one of the silver linings is that it will promote scientific literacy, because people want to know. And so it is actually our job as scientists to engage with that public that wants to understand. And I would be very grateful, and if you can cut it if you don't want to, but my team has put together an inspirational video, and this was before the pandemic hit, with Andrea Bocelli's music, and it's about the beauty of science. It's called Beautiful Science. We want to make 1 million views in 1 year.
We will try to help.
Yeah, please, if you can help. It was supposed to be used in schools, in science competitions, in scientific events. It's really beautiful. You find it on on the One Health website. And if we could make 1 million views, I think we will have, at least inspired a small critical mass.
But I mean,
is passion and is joy and is if science wins, everyone wins.
But I mean, I would say that I sort of share the aspiration, certainly, and I spent 20 years in the US, and that to me was perhaps one of the most curious things. At the very same time, I mean, following Italian media very closely, I think I pretty much see you every evening. So I mean, it is clear the same thing with Gali and another virology. So the public sphere seems to be, I mean, as you sort of pointed out, seems to be interested in serious, qualified voices.
Yes, I think so. And you're not the first person that tells me that you see me on TV virtually every day. And the thing is that I am not on TV virtually every day. So probably what they do, because I live here, is they take parts, because I go on one show on a Tuesday, and then I have sometimes they call me from the national news because they need me to give an update, and that's like 1 minute. So that's all I do. And I've been doing this for over a month. But obviously they use my interviews many times, because
but that itself I think points out to the fact that that kind of voice has become very important.
It has, yes. And then I have a story behind me, and so I think that, and I'm also, in fact, okay, one of the things that I'm very concerned about is that, and this comes from my personal experience, but the judiciary doesn't understand a lot of scientific things, and there is a pandemic which is happening, and I am a bit concerned that without knowing the reality of the facts, there could be a lot of trouble and of difficulty and hardships and of suffering around this already tragic event, because the judiciary system could act in a superficial way like they did when during my investigation. So.
Right. So, I mean, you do have a pretty strong politicization of the judiciary in Italy, and yes, your case was particularly telling. But you're seeing this in many other places as well. I mean, in the US, you have also sort of attempts at, I mean, the Attorney General now threatening with taking essentially to court governors that are trying to keep the quarantine going. So it is really quite interesting that it's not only just the policy level, but it's also the judiciary level. I mean, in a sense, we're all sort of suffering of the wave of scientific illiteracy at the time in which it's important to make decisions, right?
You're right. And actually, I think that scientists should understand that they have to give answers. They do not have to give papers. They have to give answers, because every day we are losing, each country is losing hundreds of millions, and nobody can afford this. And we shouldn't be burning this money. We should be giving answers every day, and we're not.
This is, I think that generally this is a question that probably, I come from academia myself, I mean, from philosophy, which is a very practical project. And the problem remains essentially the same, which is that, yes, I mean, one can produce very complex processes, but at the time in which things are required, we need very concrete answers.
Yeah.
Even in the public discourse, I mean, a lot of the questions that I've been asking you here are questions that are systematically posed. I mean, these are questions that I see coming up again and again and again and again. I mean, what is the quarantine for? What is that? What are we waiting for? So this is why I mean, I greatly appreciate you talking to me. I mean, this is very clarifying. I don't want to take any more time from you. I will let you enjoy the rest of Friday while there is light.
And please send me the link when you publish it, so I can tweet it, I can advertise it, I can...
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And we'll be in touch. Maybe we will bother you again for another explanation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye. Have a good weekend.
Same to you.